There's 462 jazz standards in this version of the real book alone, so which jazz standards should you focus your attention on? Which ones should you be learning? Some are more important than others, especially if you're relatively new to jazz. Now, I picked out 10 jazz standards which I think are perfect for beginners to look at. Standards which either have simple melodies that are easy to hear and replicate, relatively simple chord changes, and most importantly, common chord changes. As once you've learnt a jazz standard, it then wants to become a reference point for you, a reference point for certain harmonic changes or things like form. Question of the day, what was the first jazz standard that you learnt? Now let's get onto these 10 jazz standards. And in no particular order, at number 1 we have All of Me. The melody is very strong, very lyrical, and even just that first bit, it just uses triads, so it's a great example of how triads can be used to create melodies over chords. It's also got that thing going on with dominant chords moving in fourths, loads of secondary dominants, so that's a great one for typical ways that chords behave in jazz standards. At number 2, Autumn Leaves. Now I'm sure this would feature on many such lists like this. Why? Because the melody, it's a very easy melody to hear and play, and it moves around very easily on the fretboard. It also heavily features the major and the minor 2-5-1, so good to get an understanding of those progressions. And if you want to start doing chord melody playing, it's one of the best places to start trying to harmonise that melody. At number 3 we have Blue Bossa. It would be a shame not to include a bossa on this list. This song is great, it's got a very short form, it's a very catchy and straightforward melody to hear, so not too difficult to hear what you're trying to replicate. And in terms of the chord progression, it includes one out of key 2-5-1, which I think is great to start to get exposed to early on. It's also one where you really can say a lot over those chords with just pentatonics. So great for sort of beginning to get into soloing. At number 4 we have a blues. Things ain't what they used to be. Now I've picked this blues out. There's obviously many blues. The other one I could have maybe put in is C-Jam Blues, which has a very straightforward melody, but I think this one, it's really catchy. It's a fun sort of riff orientated melody, fun one to play. And you've got to have a good knowledge of blues to play jazz. So many of the progressions in jazz standards are derived from the typical harmonic progressions and movements in the blues, and I think this one's a great blues to have in your repertoire. At number 5 we have another bluesy tune, this time Work Song, which is kind of like a minor blues. Now this song has a fantastic kind of call and response head, which is really fun to play, and in terms of the chord changes, they're not too difficult to get used to in terms of starting to solo over. At number 6, Take the A Train. Now this standard, again, like many others on this list, it has a very strong melody, so it's easy to hear what you're trying to replicate. And also, it's a great reference point for the 2 chord becoming a dominant chord. And also, it does a very typical thing with the B section where it moves to the 4 chord. So a few very typical and nice harmonic movements happening in that one. At number 7, Satin Doll. Now, like many other tunes I've included this one because of its really strong melody, and I love the way the melody and the chords move up a tone in this particular instance. It's also a good introduction to what's called the quick 2-5, where you don't get a bar on the 2 and the 5, you get 2 beats on each chord. At number 8 we have the Miles Davis tune, So What. Now this is often taught as an introduction to modal jazz and the Dorian mode, and those are all valid things I think, but for me the best thing about learning this one, there's so few chord changes, and it's a great testing ground for you to work on developing phrases and ideas, repetition, call and response. And without the pressure of changes happening all the time, which we often get in jazz standards, you can just relax and work on those important skills of phrasing without worrying about trying to play to some chord changes. At number 9 we have Django Reinhardt's Minor Swing. Now the head, really simple, just consists of triads. If you want to call it head, it's more like an intro and outro really. And then the form is very simple. It's like a minor blues, and you can kind of just use one scale over it, or you work with your chord tones over it, and it's not too difficult to hear where those chord changes, and very easy form. So I think it's a great place in terms of learning both the chords, the melody, and starting to solo. And finally at number 10 we have Fly Me to the Moon, and I've included this on the list for a couple reasons. Again, the ease of the melody, it's to most people it's familiar already, so it's not a difficult one to learn. It's quite predictable in the way the melody works, very much like Autumn Leaves, and it includes so many typical chord progressions. So this brings me to ask you, is there anything that you would take off my list, replace it with something else, things you think I've missed? Obviously when you're trying to just do 10, it's quite difficult. Some songs that I considered but didn't include on the list, just looking at my notes down here, Song for My Father, Mr. PC, Sea Jam Blues, There Is No Greater Love, 7 Come 11 by Charlie Christian and Benny Goodman, and then Summertime and All Blues, just a few that I was sort of thinking about including, but I picked out ones mainly because chordally they're either easy to play or they're very typical of many other jazz songs, or I picked them because the melody is strong, easy to hear, easy to copy. And just a few thoughts about goals when it comes to working with jazz standards and what you want to achieve with them. Well, first off, that melody, you don't want to be relying on the real book or a lead sheet. You want to get it down from memory. You want to be able to play it, pick up your guitar if you're playing with someone else or over a backing track and play that melody from memory. Nice if you can do it in a couple octaves as well. In the same way that you want to memorize the melody, you need to memorize the chords and not have to be thinking about them. In the long run, you kind of just internalize the sound of those chords. You kind of feel the next chord change coming when you're playing it or listening to it. In order to start soloing over it, you need to have some grasp of what's going on in terms of the chords, how they're functioning. Sort of that's where, you know, being able to identify the 2-5-1s, what key you're in, what chords are in key, what chords are out of key, you know, things that I typically cover in my jazz standard lessons. If you're performing it with others, you might want to look at an intro and outro, ways that you're going to interpret that standard. You want to listen to loads of versions. If you're learning a new jazz standard, immerse yourself in it, listen to the sort of different ways that people have interpreted it. There'll be certain ones that speak to you more than others. Finally, once you feel you've got those things down, we're going to pull the rug from underneath your feet and you're going to try and do it in different keys. And this is really where learning takes place. By working on playing a standard in multiple keys, it helps you see the same chord progression and the same typical harmonic movements in other keys, which will help you learn more and more standards when you try and do things in less familiar keys to you. It's also really good for your ear, particularly, you know, if you've learnt that melody from sheet music or from tabs, say, or whatever, try and do it by ear when, you know, you're trying to translate that melody to the new key. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. My name's Andy and I do jazz guitar lessons every Wednesday and Saturday. I'll put a couple of videos up on the screen related to a couple of those standards that I mentioned, and love to know your thoughts in the comment section. Until next time, you take care.